The rain had just begun to fall over the cobbled streets of Durham. The cathedral loomed like a dark sentinel above the city, its bells silent, its towers veiled in mist. Inside the old library attached to the cathedral, Thomas Whitmore, a 37-year-old librarian, was making his nightly round. He loved the solitude of these hours, when the vast halls whispered only the rustling of pages and the faint echo of footsteps. That evening, something unusual caught his attention. A pile of books had shifted on one of the oak shelves, revealing a narrow space behind. Curiosity stirred within him, and he carefully pulled the volumes aside. To his surprise, a slim leather-bound manuscript was wedged deep inside, covered in dust as though it had been forgotten for centuries. The manuscript bore no title. Its cover was brittle, the pages fragile, written in Latin with a hand that trembled across the parchment. Thomas frowned, tracing the faded ink with his fingertip. Though he could not understand everything, certain words stood out with a chilling clarity: voices, darkness, below. His pulse quickened. He turned the pages carefully, finding a sketch of what appeared to be a map, showing a passage beneath the cathedral itself. The lines were jagged, incomplete, yet it suggested tunnels that no official record had ever mentioned. As he studied the manuscript, a cold draft swept across the library, snuffing out the nearest lamp. The silence deepened. And then, faintly, from somewhere in the shadows of the library, came the sound of a whisper. It was his name. Thomas. His breath caught in his throat. The library was empty, he had locked it himself. Yet the whisper came again, closer, more insistent, as though carried by the walls themselves. Thomas clutched the manuscript to his chest, heart hammering, realizing that the secret he had just uncovered was not meant to be disturbed. The following day, Thomas tried to dismiss the strange incident as fatigue. He had worked late nights before, and his imagination had often played tricks on him. Yet the manuscript burned in his thoughts, pulling him back to the library with a sense of compulsion he could not resist. By dusk, he was at his desk again, the manuscript open under the soft glow of a lamp. He translated what words he could, whispering them aloud as though that might help their meaning surface. Certain phrases chilled him to the bone: those who listen too closely will be claimed by the earth. Another passage read, the choir of the dead sings below the altar, and only the chosen will hear. He leaned back, staring at the brittle pages, when the air grew heavy. Once again, a voice broke the silence, soft, deliberate, just above his shoulder. Thomas. He spun round. The lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows across the tall shelves. The library was as empty as before, but this time he could not deny what he had heard. His skin prickled with cold. Determined not to flee, he whispered into the darkness. "Who is there?" No answer came. Only the faint creak of the wooden beams above, the moan of the wind against stained glass windows. But then, from deep within the library, a faint echo rose. It was not random, it was structured, a cadence like a chant. He could not make out the words, but the sound was unmistakably human. Gripping the manuscript, he followed the sound between the shelves, his footsteps muffled on the stone floor. The chanting grew stronger, leading him towards the far wall of the library, where an iron door lay half hidden behind a curtain of dust and cobwebs. Thomas had never noticed it before. The chant ceased. Silence fell, suffocating and absolute. Thomas reached for the cold iron handle, heart pounding in his chest. And as his hand touched the metal, he heard it again, his name, spoken directly from the other side of the door. Thomas froze, his hand still resting on the cold iron handle. The sound of his name had not been an echo, it had been a voice, direct and deliberate, spoken as if the speaker stood just inches away on the other side. He felt a chill seep into his bones, his breath short and uneven. The library, usually his place of comfort, had transformed into something vast and threatening, every shadow now alive with menace. He swallowed hard, trying to summon courage. His fingers tightened around the handle, and he gave it a tentative pull. To his surprise, the lock gave way with a groan, as if the door had been waiting for him all along. A rush of cold, damp air escaped the darkness beyond, carrying with it the faint scent of soil and stone long undisturbed. With the manuscript clutched under his arm, Thomas stepped through the threshold. His lantern's weak light revealed a narrow stone staircase, spiraling downward. The air grew heavier with each step he took, the silence pressing against his ears until the only sound left was the hammering of his own heartbeat. The stairs ended in a low passage carved into rough stone, its walls wet with condensation, glistening like veins. Ancient markings were etched into the rock, faded but still visible, symbols unfamiliar to him, twisting and curling in patterns that seemed almost alive. He moved cautiously, his lantern trembling in his hand, casting wavering shadows along the tunnel walls. Then he heard it again, the chant. Low, resonant, rhythmic, as if a hidden choir whispered from deep beneath the earth. This time it was louder, clearer, and hauntingly beautiful in its own dreadful way. Thomas pressed forward, his breath fogging in the chill air. The tunnel curved, and at its end, he glimpsed a wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The chanting grew insistent now, echoing around him in waves that made the stone vibrate under his feet. He reached the door and placed his hand against it, his pulse racing. As he did, the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging him into absolute blackness. And in that suffocating dark, the voices rose together as one, calling his name, not in a whisper this time, but in a chorus. Thomas. Darkness swallowed him whole. For a long moment Thomas stood motionless, his hand pressed against the door, his breath ragged in the suffocating silence. The chorus of voices that had risen in the blackness faded just as quickly as it had come, leaving only the sound of his heart racing in his ears. He fumbled desperately with his lantern, striking the flint again and again until a weak flame flickered to life. The glow revealed the damp tunnel walls around him, but the air seemed changed, heavier, denser, as though unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. Gathering what little courage he had left, Thomas pushed the wooden door with both hands. It opened with a deep groan, and beyond it stretched a chamber unlike anything he had ever seen. The ceiling arched high above, carved from the bedrock itself, and the floor was littered with fragments of broken stone and dust. At the chamber's center stood a stone platform, cracked with age, and around it were scattered bones, human bones, pale and brittle, arranged as though in patterns that made no sense. And then he heard it. The chant returned. But this time it did not echo from unseen depths. It came from the chamber itself, rising in waves that filled the hollow air. The sound was both beautiful and dreadful, a harmony that carried sorrow within every note. It was not one voice, nor two, but many, an entire choir of unseen singers. Thomas's knees weakened. He stumbled closer to the platform, his lantern shaking, the light catching on something carved into the stone. Words. Ancient words, written in Latin, the same as those in the manuscript. He bent closer to read, whispering them aloud. The earth does not bury, it remembers. The dead do not sleep, they sing. His voice trembled as he spoke the final word. At once, the chanting ceased. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, heavy and absolute, pressing against his chest like a weight. He felt the air grow colder, so cold that his breath rose in clouds. Then, in that silence, came a single voice, strong, resonant, closer than all the others had been. It did not chant. It spoke. You should not be here, Thomas. Thomas froze. The words had been clear, spoken in a tone that carried neither malice nor warmth, but something older, heavier, as if carved into the air itself. His lantern trembled in his hand, the flame shrinking under the weight of the voice. He forced himself to scan the chamber, yet it was empty, no figure stood among the bones, no shadow moved beyond his own. Who are you? He whispered, his throat dry. The silence stretched before the answer came, the voice resonating from the very stone. I am the memory of this place. Bound to the choir that lies beneath. We sing so that the earth remembers. Thomas's grip tightened on the manuscript. His thoughts raced. Could this voice be connected to the Latin words he had read, to the cursed passages hidden in the pages? The bones scattered across the chamber suddenly felt less like remnants of the dead, and more like an audience, seated in eternal silence, listening to their own song. You carry the book, the voice continued, its tone shifting, almost accusing. It should have stayed hidden. Why have you opened it? Thomas swallowed hard. I found it by chance. I only wanted to understand. To understand, the voice echoed, rising in intensity until it became a chorus once more. To understand is to awaken. The chanting swelled again, lead voices rising around him, pressing in from every wall. Thomas staggered back, his lantern swinging wildly, casting dizzying arcs of light across the chamber. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in the flicker, alive with some unearthly rhythm. Then, from the platform at the center, dust shifted. Bone fragments rattled softly, as if disturbed by unseen hands. Thomas stared in horror as a long, skeletal hand pushed free from the rubble, fingers scraping against stone. Another hand followed, clawing its way out from beneath the cracked slab. The voice fell silent. Only the sound of grinding bone remained. And in the flickering light, a figure began to rise. The figure rose slowly from the cracked platform, its skeletal frame towering over the scattered remains around it. The bones clung together unnaturally, joints twisting with a precision that defied decay. Fragments of tattered cloth still hung from its frame, remnants of a robe that must once have been ceremonial. The hollow sockets of its skull caught the lantern light, glowing faintly as though some ancient fire still burned deep within. Thomas stumbled back, pressing against the cold stone wall. His breath came in ragged gasps, his every instinct screaming at him to run, yet his legs would not obey. He was rooted to the spot, caught between terror and fascination. The choir had fallen silent. Only the slow, grinding movements of the skeletal figure filled the chamber. It straightened to its full height, the broken robe trailing like ash behind it, and turned its head towards Thomas. When it spoke, its jaw moved stiffly, but the voice that filled the chamber was the same one that had warned him before. You have read the words. Thomas tightened his grip on the manuscript. What are you? He managed to whisper. The figure took a step forward, the sound of bone scraping stone echoing in the vast chamber. We are memory. We are what the earth refused to forget. Once we were the choir, voices that lifted praise. But when the ground opened and claimed us, the song did not end. It became eternal. The lantern flickered violently, shadows stretching across the chamber. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Why show yourself to me? The figure tilted its skull, a hollow grin frozen in bone. Because you opened the book. Because you listened when you should not have. And now. Its voice deepened, led suddenly with many others, as though the entire choir spoke through it. Now you will sing with us. The bones scattered across the floor began to shift. Skulls turned, ribs scraped, hands twitched. One by one, more figures started to rise, dragging themselves from the dust, their hollow sockets glowing with the same faint fire. The chamber filled with the rattling of bones, a sound that mingled with the faint beginning of a chant. Thomas pressed himself harder against the wall, panic flooding his chest. He tried to retreat towards the tunnel, but the shadows along the walls seemed to swell, closing in, cutting off his escape. And then, from deep within the chamber, another voice rang out, different from the others, softer, sorrowful. It was not part of the choir. It called his name gently, almost pleading. Thomas. Thomas's footsteps echoed faintly as he descended deeper into the stone passage, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of earth and something ancient that had lingered for centuries. His lantern flickered, casting shadows that stretched along the curved walls, dancing like dark figures that moved just beyond his reach. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, though they still slipped away before he could grasp their meaning. At times they sounded like prayers, at others like cries for mercy. The manuscript in his satchel seemed to vibrate softly against his side, as if responding to the voices. Thomas felt compelled to take it out, and when he opened the pages, the ink shimmered faintly under the lantern's glow. Lines he had not noticed before now appeared, words scrawled in the margins in a hurried hand, "Do not awaken what sleeps below." He froze. The warning was clear, yet the voices continued, pulling him forward with irresistible force. As he pressed on, he came to an iron gate sealed with heavy chains. Through its bars he glimpsed a vast chamber filled with rows of stone sarcophagi, their lids carved with weathered figures. The air inside pulsed with a strange energy, as if the dead within were not entirely silent. Thomas's breath quickened. The whispers rose to a mournful chorus, filling his ears with a chilling harmony. And then, in the midst of the voices, one broke through, clear, sharp, and directed at him alone. "Thomas Whitmore, open the gate." He staggered back, the lantern trembling in his hand. His name had never sounded so heavy, so final. Thomas's pulse hammered in his ears as he stood frozen before the iron gate. The voice that had spoken his name still lingered, resonating in the stone walls like an echo that refused to die. He clutched the lantern tighter, trying to steady his trembling hand, but the shadows around him seemed to lean closer, eager to witness his next move. He bent towards the chained gate, inspecting the locks. They were ancient, rusted, yet unyielding. It was then he noticed something else, a figure, faint but discernible, standing beyond the bars. At first Thomas thought it was a trick of the light, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw it clearly, a man draped in tattered robes, his face obscured by a hood. The figure did not move, yet its presence was undeniable. The whispers quieted, replaced by a single low hum that seemed to radiate from the figure itself. "Who are you?" Thomas's voice cracked in the silence. The figure tilted its head, and though no lips moved beneath the hood, a voice entered Thomas's mind as if it had always been there. "I am the Keeper. The last warden of what must never walk this earth again." Thomas staggered back, the manuscript pressing against his ribs like a burden too heavy to carry. "Then why call my name? Why summon me here?" The Keeper raised an arm, and the lantern's flame sputtered violently, almost dying before it steadied again. "Because you hold the key. The book you carry was never meant to leave these walls. By opening its pages, you have awakened their hunger. They know you now." Thomas's breath caught. The voices in the chamber swelled, not in whispers this time, but in restless murmurs like prisoners rattling their chains. The sarcophagi seemed to tremble ever so slightly, dust spilling from their edges. The Keeper's voice returned, colder now. "You must choose, Thomas Whitmore. Seal the book, and the whispers will hunt you until your final breath. Or, open the gate, and let them claim what they desire." Thomas gripped the manuscript with white knuckles, torn between terror and the strange compulsion gnawing at his soul. Every instinct told him to run, but the way back felt impossibly far, as though the tunnel itself would not allow escape. The iron gate groaned, as though it too awaited his decision. The chamber seemed to close in around Thomas, its air thick with dread. His lantern flickered, throwing jagged shadows across the sarcophagi. The whispers had grown more insistent, overlapping in a frantic chorus that tugged at the edges of his mind. Each voice called his name, not as an invitation, but as a demand. He clutched the manuscript to his chest, feeling the ancient leather pulse faintly under his palm, as if it were alive. His thoughts scrambled. Could he truly return it and be free, as the Keeper implied? Or had he already gone too far, his fate sealed the moment he first turned its brittle pages? Beyond the gate, the hooded Keeper remained motionless, a silent sentinel awaiting his answer. But the silence stretched too long, and soon the Keeper spoke again, this time with a tone like iron against stone. "If you hesitate, they will decide for you." Thomas's knees buckled as the ground beneath him trembled. One of the sarcophagi shifted with a sound that clawed at his very bones. A crack spread along its surface, releasing a stale breath of air that smelled of earth and centuries of decay. Thomas staggered back, his lantern swinging wildly. "No," he muttered through clenched teeth. "This is not mine to carry." He turned, meaning to flee, but the tunnel behind him had altered. What had been a straight passage now bent unnaturally, the walls twisting like sinew. The way back was gone, swallowed by the chamber's hunger. Thomas spun again to face the keeper, his desperation burning into anger. "You said I must choose, but there is no choice. The book was never mine, yet it clings to me like a curse." The keeper's hood shifted, and though his face remained hidden, Thomas felt the weight of unseen eyes pierce through him. "You opened the gate within yourself, long before you stepped foot here. That is why the manuscript found you. That is why they hunger for you." The whispers surged to a crescendo, the voices no longer pleading but commanding, each one striking like a lash. "Open! Open! Open!" The lock on the gate shuddered as if something immense pressed against it from the other side. Dust fell in a steady stream, and Thomas's heart pounded so violently he feared it might burst. He knew then that the chamber would not allow him to leave unmarked. One way or another, the choice would bind him. His trembling fingers drifted towards the manuscript's clasp, as though pulled by an unseen hand. The moment stretched, unbearable, as the gate rattled and the keeper raised his arm like a judge about to deliver sentence. And then, with a sound like the snapping of bone, the clasp of the manuscript sprang open on its own.